Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Gopi Jana Kamacharya Stapa ki jai, Prem Sudha Masti Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Seva Degadada Shakti Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Jai, Sri Radha Krishna Gopal Govida Shama Prabhu Radha Krishna Giri Govardhana ki jai, Sri Vrindavan Dham ki jai, Navadip Dham ki jai, Gamu Shimana Tulsi Bhakti Devi ki jai, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai, Samavetta Bhakta Vrinda ki jai, Go Premanandi, Go Sri Samador, Samador, Sri Samador, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Krishnaya Rupavani Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Nami Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Prachadane Nirvisesha Shrunjavari Pastrachadesha Tadane Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasri Gaura Karinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam chapter 6. Which verse is it? Takes 2. 2. Okay. Kala Sangyam Tada Devim Viprachakti Urukrama Trayo Vinsati Tatvana Ganam Yugapada Vishat Kala Sangyatam, known as Kali, Tada, at that time, Devim, goddess, Vibrat, destructive, Saktim, potency, Urukrama, the supreme powerful, Trayavimsati, 23, Tatvanam, of the elements, Ganam, all of them, Yugapat, simultaneously, Avishat, entered. Translation: the supreme, powerful Lord then simultaneously entered into the 23 elements with the goddess Kali, his external energy, who alone amalgamates all the different elements. Purport: the ingredients of matter are counted as 23. The total material energy, false ego, sound, touch, form, taste, smell, earth, water, fire, air, sky, eye, ear, nose, tongue, skin, hand, leg, evacuating organ, genitals, speech, and mind. All are combined together by the influence of time and are again dissolved in the course of time. Time, therefore, is called the energy of the Lord and acts in her own way by the direction of the Lord. This energy is called Kali and is represented by the dark, destructive goddess, generally worshipped by persons influenced by the mode of darkness or ignorance in material existence. In the Vedic hymn, this process is described as Mula Prakritir Avikritir Maha Adayaha Prakriti Vikritayaha Sapta Sodasa Kastu Vikarana Prakritir Na Vikriti Purushaha. The energy which acts as material nature is a combination of 23 ingredients. It is not a final source of creation. The Lord enters into the elements and applies his energy called Kali. In all other Vedic scriptures, the same principle is accepted. In Brahma Samhita, it is stated, Ekopya Savrachaitam Jagadanda Kotim Yachaktir Asti Jagadanda Chaya Yadanta Andantarasta Paramanu Chayantarastam Govindam Adipurusham Tamaham Bhajami. I worship the primeval Lord Govinda, who is the original personality of Godhead. By his partial plenary expansion, Mahavishnu, he enters into material nature and then into each and every universe as Garbhodakshai Vishnu, and then as Kshirodakshai Vishnu into all the elements, including every atom of matter. Such manifestations of the cosmic creation are innumerable, both in the universes and in individual atoms. Similarly, this is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita, Atava Bahunaitina Kim Yattena Tavarjuna Vishtabhyaham Idam Kritsnam Ekam Sena Stito Jagat. O Arjuna, there is no necessity of your knowing about my innumerable energies, which act in various ways. I enter into the material creation by my partial plenary expansion, Paramatma, or the Supersoul, in all the universes and in all the elements thereof, and thus the work of creation goes on. The wonderful activities of material nature are due to Lord Krishna, and thus he is the final cause or the ultimate cause of all causes. Translation: the powerful, supreme powerful Lord then simultaneously entered into the 23 elements with the goddess Kali, his external energy, who alone amalgamates all the different elements. This chapter is about creation in terms of Vishwarupa, or the universal form. And if you studied Bhagavatam, you'll see in the second canto there is several descriptions of the universal form, and in the third canto as well. So probably we get 5 or 6 descriptions of this universal form. Very similar in the second and third cantos, and even in later cantos. So this description is often repeated. And it's also explained, this is not a real form of the Lord like Krishna or Vishnu. We have spiritual forms that are indestructible. This is material. So it's quite a different type of form. Yet we'll find like 6 descriptions of this within 2 volumes of the Bhagavatam. So there's a lot of emphasis put upon this, in spite of the fact that it is material. This does not mean that this is what we should worship, because it is also explained in the 2nd canto itself that this meditation on this form of the Lord, who has Satyaloka as his head and Patalaloka as his feet, etc., is an inferior form. And immature yogis may meditate on this form, but mature yogis will meditate on Paramatma, who's an actual spiritual form. In other words, the form is at the lowest level of meditation, but it is there because we need something to meditate upon, and it is also related to the Supreme Lord, because here we'll find how the Lord is behind this universal form, even though it's material. But it is, in one sense, easier for people to conceive of because it's made of things they're familiar with, material elements. Whereas we talk about spiritual form. Well, what is spirit? How can I meditate on a form that's all spiritual? Is it like, subtle? Is it invisible or whatever? We don't know. So therefore, for people who are speculative or whatever, they're given a solid form to meditate on, made out of material elements. So that is why it is considered, valuable for some people. At the same time, it's an inferior form of meditation. And the other reason for discussing this universal form is that it describes creation, how everything arises in this material world. But it describes it in a way which is non-atheistic. In other words, it's not just Big Bang and everything happened, all the material elements got there somehow or other. It's a very calculated manifestation of material elements by the will of the Lord in a certain way with certain purposes. So that is, to do that, we have the image of a body, and particularly a human-like body with head, eyes, ears, nose, hands and feet, torso, etc. So easily recognizable. We can think, okay, it's got a form, a human-like form. And what is a human-like form? It is obviously organized. So we have a head that's got a brain in it. We got eyes that are used for seeing. We got feet used for walking. With hands used for grasping. So it's got all parts arranged in specific ways for us. And that does not arise by chance. It happens because there's a certain purpose involved. And if you didn't have your hands and your feet and your arms and your legs and your eyes, you wouldn't be able to do anything in this world. So everything has its purpose. Of course, the other way of explaining it, well, that's how chance mutations happen. And then finally, we develop eyes or something to see and whatever in order to survive as creatures in this material world. So that's the evolutionary theory of everything. But here we got a quite different type of conception of how creation takes place. It's planned out. It's not chance. So the eye is there because it was planned to be an eye, not because by chance something formed into an eye. So that's so with the whole body. Okay? So instead of saying that the human body is a product of chance evolution, by just mutations, etc. No, the body of the human being, the body of the animals, the body of the devatas, all of this is calculated ahead of time. It's all planned out very carefully. Like you build a house, you got to have a plan and you put it together in a certain way, and it works properly with the doors and the windows, etc. Yeah. So the creation is of the same sort. It's all carefully planned out. Ultimately by the Supreme Lord, secondarily by Lord Brahma, who takes all the materials and sticks them together and makes bodies and planets, etc. So the first so-called creation is what we call sarga, in which the elements appear. So just as we have our modern elements, you have in your science class, you have the chart with all the elements on it, the hydrogen and oxygen, all these things. There are 108 or 112 elements like that. Huh? And they say, okay, that's what composes matter, and these things come together, and we get everything we see here. So we have another idea like that in the Bhagavatam here, where it talks about the 23 elements. So it's not 100 and whatever elements, it's 23 elements. So it's, let's say, a briefer number, smaller number of elements. But they're not like the elements that we are familiar with in the material world, which are all very gross things that you can, or tangible things, you know, gases and solids and metals, etc. These are very, very subtle things. Even the grossest element, like earth and water and air and fire and ether, these are called the Panchamahabhutas, or the 5 gross elements. Yeah? So they're definitely grosser than the other elements, but even these are quite subtle. So we cannot even perceive that type of pure water or pure air or pure earth. They have to start combining together in certain proportions, then they get solid things like we see here on Earth. So even the gross elements are quite subtle. But then more subtle than that, we see things like senses. How can your senses be elements? So we say, here's your eye, but it's made out of, material elements and molecules, etc., like that. So how can that be an element? But it's a different type of element. It's a very subtle element, that eye. And of course, based on that eye, we get the eyes that we have, and the ears and the hands and feet, etc. So we get subtle senses, 5 subtle knowledge gathering senses, 5 action senses like hands and feet and voice. And then we get the mind. This is an element. And we'll say, well, what is mind in the modern world? Well, mind is just something that comes out of your brain when you start thinking or whatever, like that. That becomes your mind. But here, mind is an actual element in creation itself. Very subtle, obviously. And we get things like false ego, which is even more subtle, which is your material identification with the body, which is like almost a abstract conception, but this is an element of all things. And more subtle than that, we got Mahatattva, which is a mysterious substance. We can say it's the first and most primitive visible manifestation of matter. Very, very subtle and very sattvic. But it's the first visible aspect. And beyond that is the most subtle, called Prakriti, which no one can ever see. It's so subtle. But it is the basis of all these other elements coming out. So that's something like in modern science, they have something called the dark energy or the black matter. They know that the universe is made out of more than we can see and more than we can even conceive of. There's I think it's 80% or 90%. It's something we don't even know what it is. We can't perceive it with any physical instrument, but it must be there according to the theory of science. So that's the black matter, so to speak. So perhaps that's this Prakriti. Nobody can ever see it or detect it. It's so subtle, but it is matter, and it's necessary. And it's out of that we get all of these other elements coming. And then these elements combine together in certain proportions, and then we get the material elements that we see are 100 and what all the elements. We get the combinations into objects, we get the bodies, we get the planets, like that. So it's a very complex system, all worked out ahead of time, and everything has to combine in a proper way, and it doesn't operate by itself. Now, it talks here about the energy, the goddess, or the energy of Kala, or time. So it's often described how the time energy is the stimulus for material creation. So somehow time is involved. A very subtle aspect of material energy is time, and it has to act. But then there's another subtle element itself. So it's described how Mahavishnu must glance over material energy, and then it can become activated. Plus, time is there as well. So, a glance of the Lord means it's only by the will of the Lord that Prakriti starts to agitate and create all these elements of Mahatattva, Ahankara, and all the gross elements. So, in other words, the Supreme Lord is behind everything, and only when He wills, then time will operate, and then time agitates everything, and we get material elements manifesting. But then there's an added factor also. It still doesn't operate unless the Lord places the Atmas or the Jivas into the matter. So we have three factors: glance of the Lord, injection of Jivas, and time. Simultaneously operate, and then Prakriti transforms into Mahatattva. And then Mahatattva turns into Ahankara. Ahankara manifests all the other elements. So that's the general procedure. And the idea we should learn from this is behind it is the Supreme Lord, that's Mahavishnu. That's okay. People generally accept that also if they read the scriptures. But then Bhagavatam goes further than that. Okay, Mahavishnu, the Supreme Lord, in control of everything. But Mahavishnu is only an expansion of the forms of the Lord in the spiritual world. He's like in the borderline and what we call the Karna ocean, which is a borderline between the material world and the spiritual world. So he's a borderline form of the Supreme Lord. Then we have the Supreme Lord in the spiritual world itself, who looks exactly like the Vishnu who's lying down, Mahavishnu, but he's actually in the spiritual world. So he's slightly different because he expands into this Mahavishnu. So in other words, we have a spiritual form of the Lord, then we have the functional form of Mahavishnu who glances over Prakriti and injects jivas using time energy. Right? So this Mahavishnu is like a functional aspect of the Supreme Lord. But Supreme Lord is free, so he's got his form in the spiritual world that doesn't have to glance anything, he doesn't have to worry about material world at all. So that's the Vishnu in the spiritual world, Narayana. But then Bhagavatam goes further than that, and it says, yes, there's many forms of Vishnu in the spiritual world. It has a whole enumeration in Chaitanya Charitamrita of holding the chakra in one hand, like all the possible combinations, mathematical combinations of four hands and where the chakra and the conch go, etc. We get all those forms there. And we get extra forms as well, like avatar forms. And they all have their particular abodes because they all have their own devotees. So it's like spiritual sky is infinitely divided into parts where we have different forms of the Lord and we have all the jivas there with their particular forms worshiping and serving. But above that, then we get Goloka, which is, I think, in the first canto on the Bhagavatam. It's the first canto. There's all the things there, the universes and then spiritual world. And then in the middle, we got the lotus with Goloka in it. And in Goloka, we have Krishna. So this is actually the whole purport of the Bhagavatam. Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. There are many forms of God which are enumerated in the Bhagavatam, and we have descriptions in this canto, in the second canto and first canto. But the ultimate form of God is Krishna. So therefore, Krishna expands into the Vishnu forms, Vishnu expands into Mahavishnu, and then that Mahavishnu creates the material world. So we have all these descriptions about Mahavishnu, but you should not forget that behind that is ultimately going back to Krishna. So he's the highest form. But the forms in the spiritual world, like the Vishnu forms, and then Krishna himself, don't have to do anything with creation at all. They're completely apart from it. They don't have to worry about anything. Okay? This creation of the material world and supervising it and then destroying it, making it all dissolve again, that's a lesser activity of the Supreme Lord. Just as glance will do that, but still it's a lesser activity. And of course the Lord enters into it also as Garbhadaksha Vishnu, Shuddhaksha Vishnu enters into the world also. So these are considered lesser expansions, and the real ultimate manifestation of Supreme Lord with all of his qualities is in the spiritual world. So that's the preferable form of the Lord we should worship. So besides that, then we get this form, which is the universal form, which is even less. because Mahavishnu glances, etc., and all this. And this form is not, that's a spiritual body, Mahavishnu, but this form is a material form. It's not, it's, once it's imaginary form. So it's actually the whole universe in the form of a body to show us that everything is organized very nicely. So we got these elements here, and they're placed on the body of the Lord. And then we get the senses, which are elements, placed on the body. So we get the eyes and the ears and the nose and the hands and the feet, etc., placed on the body. The mind and the ahankara, all these things placed on this body, this, which is all material, because these are all material things. And then what happens? All these material things are created, and that form cannot do anything at all. It just sits there. It cannot see, it cannot walk, it cannot do anything. So only when the Supreme Lord enters into it, like the soul enters our body, then we can operate. So Supreme Lord enters into that universe, energizes it. Then all the things happen, and the eyes can see, and the ears can hear, etc. The hands can grasp, and the feet can walk. So this means that without the will of the Supreme Lord, all of these combinations of material elements cannot function properly, coherently, and like a human form can operate. Will of the Lord is behind everything in material nature. If we get on a lesser level, of course, then we see the body itself. We got our whole body planned out by the Supreme Lord and everything. It cannot also operate unless there's an Atma inside, unless there's a Jiva inside it. So it's not just matter. Behind matter is the spirit. Behind the whole universe is Supreme Lord. Behind the individual bodies is the particular Atma, or the Jiva. But on the larger scale, all this is planned out by the Supreme Lord, and therefore we have this figure of the Vishwarupa, or the universal form there, to show that everything is made according to a particular plan, but it doesn't operate until the Lord puts his energy into it. He enters like the Atma of the universal form, and then it begins to operate. In other words, everything ultimately depended on the Supreme Lord. So that's the basic message we get from this universal form. So that's, we could say, important for us to realize, because if you get modern education, basically you'll learn all about the material elements, nickel and iron and all these things like that. And okay, they're just molecules with a certain number of protons and electrons or whatever like that. That's they combine together, and we get the universe. That's what it is. The same molecules combine, and they make little cells, and the cells combine and they make bigger bodies, etc. Then we get human beings. So that's what the material idea of creation is. This the combination of material things. Somehow they just get together, and we don't know how, and they make bodies. But here it's quite different. It's all planned out, and the Supreme Lord is necessary, and the Atma, or the Jiva, is also necessary to make everything work in this material world. And without that, nothing happens. So I mentioned at the very beginning that Prakriti sits there until time is there, will of the Lord is there, and injection of Jivas. So without the Jivas in the material world, it doesn't operate. Without the Atmas there, nothing happens. So there's a very intimate connection between the Atmas and material energy. If there's no Atmas there, it's useless. So it doesn't manifest at all. It simply sits there, invisible, Prakriti. So you need the Jivas in there. Why? Because the Jivas make bodies, they operate like this. Yeah? So in other words, the whole purpose of the universe is life, as you know, the material bodies with the Jiva inside it. So the Jiva can operate a material body. That's the whole purpose of the universe, according to this. So, but that's the conception that we have behind everything, is some intelligence, the intelligence ultimately the Supreme Lord, secondary the Jiva. And this is the purpose of the whole material world. Okay, any question there?
So, Maharaj, this Vishwarupa, universal form, how does that compare with the universal form that Krishna showed to Arjuna in Bhagavad Gita?
Yeah. The similarity is it's all material elements. That's the same thing. It's all material, because within that universal form that Arjuna saw, he saw all the devatas and the demons and the planets and the elements, etc. So similar. We have another one, universal form, in when Krishna shows the universe inside himself. It's like a universal form. Also, it's all the universe and elements like that. So in that way, they're similar to this one. The difference is that this one is particularly used to show evolution of material elements and how they relate to each other, that we have the eye, and we have the devata of the eye, and we have the sense object of the eye. We get the material elements, so they're all related. So it illustrates the relationship between sense object and devata and sense, etc. So in that sense, it shows how the functions of these different elements operate. Otherwise, it's very similar in the sense it's all material things.
No, sometimes that universal form is described as imaginary.
Yeah.
But obviously, when Krishna showed it to Arjuna, that's not imaginary.
Yeah.
So.
We can say temporary form in that sense, because matter is temporary. So, in other words, it's distinct from the eternal forms of the Lord, like Vishnu with his 4 arms, or Krishna, or Nrsimhadev with his line. These are not temporary forms, they're eternal, and they never get created or destroyed. Whereas the universal form is, if the Lord wants, he can manifest that universal form to Arjuna, but then it will disappear again, so it's temporary, and it's of course made out of material elements. But he can manifest it so you can see it, definitely. But it's also, and this one here is actually imaginary. It's just a concept to make us realize how matter is operating in relation to the Supreme Lord.
In the purport, Prabhupada mentions a partial plenary expansion.
Oh.
So what does that mean in terms of, because how can you have a part of the whole?
Oh well, part of a part of a part. We have amsa, a portion of a portion of a portion. So we use that term sometimes to describe, like we have Krishna, and he's Bhagavan in full, and we get Balaram, who is almost like that, and then Balaram expands into Shankarshan, and then in the Vaikuntha we get the Chaturvyuhas, and then the Shankarshan there expands into Mahavishnu. Mahavishnu expands into Garbhodaksha Vishnu, expands into Kshirodaksha Vishnu. So as one expands into the other, then there's a little bit less powers. Less powers. So that's when we can say partial plenary portion or whatever. Plenary itself means full. So in one sense, they are all full. So any form of an avatar or Kshirodaksha Vishnu is Supreme Lord. So he's Bhagavan also in one sense, He's got all the powers of the Lord. He's not material in any way. But at the same time, the manifestation of powers is much less.
But how does that fit with the description of Brahma Samhita, Departure Evahita Santanam? The other verse in the Brahma Samhita, Departure Evahita Santanam, where he talks about that they're all...
Oh, like the lamps. Yeah, so that's because they're all Vishnu Tattva. They're all Ishvara Tattva. So in that sense, they're all one. So like the lamps are all one. But then we do differentiate. Krishna and Vishnu are non-different, we say, yeah? They're all one Bhagavan. There's no 2 Bhagavans, 3 Bhagavans. It's all one Supreme Lord. We're monotheistic. But the Lord manifests different forms, and in those different forms, he'll manifest different amounts of qualities. So Krishna is most perfect and manifests 64 qualities. Vishnu, 60 qualities, and say Shiva, 55 qualities. But then we say Krishna and Vishnu are the same. How can it be different? So it's just the manifestation of the qualities in the form of Vishnu. Vishnu does not manifest. We say he's the same, so he has all the qualities, but he won't manifest them in that particular form. Whereas in the form of Krishna, he manifests all 64 qualities.
The qualities are there.
They don't manifest. Yeah, it's like the example is given of the moon. So we have the Purnima, the full moon, full manifestation of the light. We have the next day after that, and the next day after that, a little bit less light. Same moon, but it manifests less and less light.
So the plenary means all the qualities are there. Partial means they're...
Yeah, but even we use plenary portion for the because we're calling them portions again. So we use those for like a plenary portion of the Lord is Mahavishnu, we'll say. But actually he has less manifestation of qualities. So it's not actually full, but it's full because he is Supreme Lord. Yeah. Now if you want to get a little more accurate detail, we can say they're not a real plenary portion at all when we have Shaktivesh avatars or Guna avatars. So they're like Brahma's a jiva, Shaktivesh avatars are jiva, so they're quite distinct. So they're not full at all, but they got some powers of the Lord. So that's even a lesser category.
When you said that Atmas were all placed here, to your understanding, because I've heard a couple of different explanations, do they come here because they all like fell down because we grew selfish, or do we kind of choose to come here?
Oh, how do the jivas get placed into Prakriti by Mahavishnu when he glances and puts them in there? Yeah, so they're actually all, in one sense, sleeping in Mahavishnu. And then they get placed in. So why do they get placed in? Because they were in a previous universe, which got destroyed, or many universes were there. They all went into Pralaya state, got destroyed, and all the jivas, they rest in Mahavishnu. So they had previous experiences of previous universes, and they had previous desires, and they have all these karmas stuck to them still. So all the jivas within Mahavishnu got these karmas, and therefore, according to what they deserve, then they get placed in a universe. So the cause of getting placed in the universe is because they have desires and they have these karmas to experience.
From the last round.
Yeah. So it's a continuous, and you never get rid of your karmas in general because you make new karmas every time you live. So it's an endless cycle. So they keep on going forever. So therefore, Mahavishnu breathes in, breathes out, breathes in, breathes out, and the universe is created, the universe is destroyed. The jivas get injected, they come out and they rest for a while. They've still got their karmas, they go back in again. Get more karmas, go back in. They get more desires, they come out again. So it's a continual process of creation and destruction of everything, which is a little bit more advanced than, modern scientists also, some may think like that also. Usually just think of the Big Bang.
They say it just ends.
Yeah, but we say it's repeated over and over again. I think there's a few scientists will agree with that also, but
Really?
I think so, yeah.
Maharaj, do the elements exist in the same way in the spiritual world? Do they combine the way they do here?
Well, there is no material elements in the spiritual world.
But as far as like there's water
and
there's fire, and so how do they exist?
Yeah. So these elements are from this Prakriti, which is the external energy of the Lord, the Bahiranga Shakti, which is Achit, unconscious, etc. There's another energy called the Chit Shakti, which is spiritual energy. So it can act in a kind of similar way, but everything is chit, everything is conscious, everything is spiritual. So it produces elements and forms and trees and planets and bodies, and everything comes out of this chit. Just like this energy gives rise to material forms, that energy gives rise to spiritual forms and spiritual abodes, places, planets, etc. So it's a Chit Shakti.
Just a comment, Maharaj. When you were talking about the brain and the mind, so they've done experiments now, material scientists, where they can actually prove that the mind is something separate to the brain.
Yeah.
Even the materialists agree with that now.
Yeah. Even in the 1980s, I think there were some brain scientists that realized that the mind is different from the brain, actually. The brain is a mechanical function. The mind seems to operate separately from it. But for us, even mind also is quite different from the concept of the scientists, I think. They all think that it's consciousness. They call it mind consciousness, but we say mind is a material element. Then it makes your subtle body, your sukshma sarira. It's a fine matter. So it's not conscious also. Consciousness comes from the jiva, or the atma, which is completely spiritual. So scientists won't make that distinction between the conscious atma and the mind. It's all kind of one. The mind is equal to consciousness, like that. So it's a little bit indistinct, but we make a big distinction there. And of course, both are distinct from the brain. So the material brain is distinct from the material mind. Your subtle body, so to speak, your sukshma sarira, made out of mind. They are distinct because this is very gross. That subtle mind is very subtle, and we can't see it, whatever like that. So they are distinct. But then we also distinguish this atma, the jiva, is separate from that also. Scientists?
Yeah, it's 1/10,000th the tip of a hair.
Well, actually, it has no real size by material standards. It's beyond material limitations. So we can say it's so small that you could never see it. it has no dimension by material means, and your material instruments and your eye could never detect it because it's not a material thing. So in that sense, somebody the other day asked the question, okay, something like 21 grams, was it? There was a movie called 21 grams. the 21 grams was what goes out of your body when you die. So then that must be the soul or something like that. So because you get less weight after you're dead, and before, okay, you could explain it different ways, maybe some gases going on your body, whatever. But the other explanation was, well, your subtle body also is there. Subtle body is material, so it has weight. So that goes out of your body with the soul. So that could be the weight of the 21 grams, if it is true or not. But the soul itself would not have weight as such.
Yes, you said, Mom, not seeing it, but there's so many anecdotal stories of people with their loved ones when they die, seeing the blue light or the...
Yeah, so we have what we call anecdotal proof of the soul, because people are brain dead. And so the brain is no longer operating. The nerves are not firing. Nothing is happening. Those little things coming out of your brain, the waves aren't there anymore. Heart is not operating. But yet people have experiences during that time. They can see things, they can hear things, and whatever. And they can even confirm that what they saw or what they heard is true when they're supposed to be dead. So how, it's not the brain operating, obviously, it's something else operating. So we say, we can explain that in terms, of course, they'll just say it's, well, okay, the soul or the eternal soul, proof of the soul. But it's also due to the fact that you have a subtle body, and the subtle body can also see, can also hear. No, it's material. That's here that when it talks about the senses and the material elements, these are the subtle senses and the mind.
That's why you can have out-of-body experience.
Yes, because your subtle body with the mind and your subtle senses going out, and then you can see with your subtle senses, and you can see your body here, lying here, like that. So some people see when they have a car accident or something, motorcycle accident, and they go out of the body, and they're looking at the ambulance come and everything like this, but they're seeing it from different eye, not this, because this eye is stuck to the body that's not functioning anymore, but they can see it with another body with different senses. So it's the subtle body and the Atma combined, which gives us that experience. So that's our explanation. Material scientists, they say maybe it's the soul or something like that.
Thank you for the class, Maharaj. You're mentioning about the universal form, and we hear the Virat Rupa. It's also for people to start appreciating the gross, the subtle elements in nature. And we hear in Mahabharata that Duryodhana did see the universal form, and there's a saying, seeing is believing, but it's not necessarily true. Like also in devotional life, we have so many miracles in our daily life. We have access to this, all the scriptures, to the program because of Srila Prabhupada's mercy, but we don't really, sometimes I guess speaking for myself, appreciate how much we have and the miracles we have. So what is that element? So someone may see like Duryodhana, the universal form, but not really appreciate it. So how can we develop that gratitude and the eyes to appreciate the...
Oh, well, we have different levels of people, so on different levels, but that question also comes up in Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna asks, well, this is also spiritual Atma, everything like that, but how are you manifested in this world? I want to see something in this world that manifests you. So then he gives chapter 10. If you want to see, you can see a reflection of me in something material, like the big mountain, or the tree, or the ocean, or the lion who has his power, whatever like that. So by seeing certain things in the material world, which have certain excellence in them, certain beauty or certain strength, we can, let's say, intuit, or we can say infer a greater wonderful quality in the Supreme Lord. So that's the first level of appreciation of the Lord. We can appreciate material nature and say, okay, it's beautiful because there's some beautiful person making it or creating it, like that. So that's the most primitive level. But then you get the universal form element, where we say, okay, it's all this, everything in the material world, all these wonderful things you see are stuck in a big form, and we'll call that Supreme Lord. So that's another conception. The other is we get to the actual form of the Lord, spiritual form from that. Yeah? But that we can't see, so all we can do is look at the scriptures and meditate on those. But then we also get the deity forms. So that's the easy way. Instead of meditating, we look at the deity form, and thereby we can get an idea of the Supreme Lord. However, because we do have our eyes covered, we got material eyes now, then we will tend to see materially. So the only way we can bridge the gap between that form and spiritual vision is to develop our bhakti, our devotion. So we get spiritual eyes. As it says, premanjana, you put the ointment of prema on your eyes, then you will see the form of the Lord. So the more we do bhakti, the more we can actually see the form of the Lord and appreciate that. Not only seeing, but as you said, in your daily life or whatever, the more you advance and the more you develop your bhakti, then the more you're able to perceive how the Lord is acting in the material world itself, not just through his form, but in other ways as well. Okay, fine. Oh, fine. Okay. Hari Om, John. Hare Krishna.